Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I've never been good with silence. Growing up in a bustling household, the noise was constant. Arguments, laughter, clinking dishes, the murmur of the TV. But now, in the quiet of my empty home, the silence presses down on me, heavy and unyielding. My parents had decided to take a weekend getaway, leaving me behind to tend to the house. I'd agreed to stay, partly out of a sense of responsibility, partly because I figured it would be a good time to get some much-needed space. The first evening passed without incident. I spent it curled up in my favorite chair with a book, the occasional creak of the house's old wood the only thing disturbing the peace. The walls seemed to sigh with every gust of wind outside, but I was used to it. It wasn't until night fully fell that things began to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and the house, which had once felt like a safe haven, began to feel unfamiliar. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I'd gone to bed early, hoping to catch up on sleep, but something kept me tossing and turning. The house seemed to pulse, the air thick with tension. I heard a soft noise from the hallway. A light scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up, listening. But the house was still, no footsteps, no more noises. I shook my head, muttering to myself that I was just tired. Then the lights flickered. It was brief, barely noticeable at first, just a quick blink before they stabilized again. But then it happened again, and again. I jumped out of bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a problem with the wiring. I checked the switch and tried adjusting the bulbs, but nothing seemed to explain the strange interruptions. I went back to my room, but the unease lingered, gnawing at me. The noises continued in the house. The whisper of something brushing against the walls, faint as a sigh, and the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but every time I glanced toward the hallway, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me. That's when I saw it. Slipped under my bedroom door, a small note. It was plain, written hastily, and the words scrawled on it made my stomach drop. I see you. My hand shook as I picked it up, reading it again. Who would leave such a thing? The house next door was always quiet, its occupants distant and unremarkable. But then I remembered Mr. Harris, an older man who lived alone, whose strange behavior always left me with a nagging feeling of discomfort. There was no mistaking the warning in that note, though. You shouldn't have stayed here. It seemed impossible, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if the note itself had some kind of malevolent presence. What was happening in my own house? And more importantly, who had been watching me? The morning didn't bring any relief. In fact, when I stumbled out of bed to check the house, everything felt off. The note from last night still weighed heavily on my mind, the words echoing in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the eerie silence that had once felt peaceful now made my skin crawl. My eyes kept darting toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing just outside, peering in. I forced myself to focus on something. Anything. That could break the creeping tension. I thought of Mr. Harris, the neighbor who lived next door. He was always a little too observant for my liking, always in his window, always watching. I'd often catch him staring, though he'd quickly look away when I noticed. His house was tucked away behind a high hedge, and I never saw many visitors. I'd spoken to him only once when I first moved in. His voice was pleasant enough, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke, as if he knew more than he was letting on. He had that look in his eyes like he was hiding something. Maybe it was just his age. Maybe it was just the way he never really smiled. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had something to do with the note, so I decided to confront him. If nothing else, it would give me a sense of closure. I put on my shoes, bracing myself against the chill of the morning air, and walked next door, the sound of my footsteps seeming too loud against the quiet. His house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and foreboding. When I knocked, it took a few moments before the door creaked open. Mr. Harris stood there, his face a little more weathered than I remembered, but his eyes were still sharp, and his smile, though faint, was unnervingly knowing. "Ah, Claire, how lovely to see you," he said, his voice warm but somehow too rehearsed. "What brings you by?" I hesitated. Should I mention the note? Should I just ask if he had anything to do with it? I didn't know where to begin, so I went with honesty. "I just wanted to ask you something, Mr. Harris. Last night, I found a strange note under my door. It said, "I see you. Do you know anything about it?" His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed for just a second. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "Come in, Claire. You've come all this way. I've been looking out for you. It's important to stay safe, you know." I stepped inside hesitantly, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity was stronger. The inside of his house was just as strange as I remembered. Dim, cluttered, with the scent of old wood and something metallic in the air. The hallway was narrow, and I noticed cameras positioned around the house, some pointed toward the windows, others just sitting in odd corners. But it wasn't until I turned to face him again that I realized how out of place everything truly was. Mr. Harris seemed to be watching me closely, too closely. "You're a very interesting young woman, Claire. I've been keeping an eye on you for a while now. It's important to know who lives around you, don't you think?" I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but his words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean, keeping an eye on me?" My voice faltered, but I pressed on. "Why would you do that?" His lips curled into a thin smile as he walked to a nearby cabinet, pulling it open. "It's my job, you could say, to protect those who don't realize they need it." He paused before adding, "You've been in danger, Claire, and I've been trying to keep you safe. But you've got to understand the bigger picture." Before I could respond, he opened a door at the end of the hallway. The room inside was dark, and as I stepped closer, the flicker of old monitors came into view. I realized, with mounting horror, that they weren't just cameras. They were recordings, footage of my own house, my life. On the screens, I could see myself, walking down the street, sitting at my kitchen table, coming home from work. My pulse quickened as I took in the horrifying reality of it all. "You've been watching me," I choked out, my voice trembling. He nodded, stepping toward me. "For a long time, Claire. You've never been alone, not really. I've been here all along." The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. There was something unnatural about the way he spoke, as though he wasn't just talking about physical safety, but something deeper, darker. I tried to back away, but Mr. Harris grabbed my arm gently, his grip surprisingly strong for someone his age. "Don't be scared. I've waited for this moment. I've made sure everything will be perfect." My heart was pounding in my chest, and the room seemed to close in on me with every breath I took. Mr. Harris's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel the heat of his fingers pressing into my skin, his touch unnervingly steady. I wanted to scream, to break free, but the words stuck in my throat. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. My gaze shifted to the monitors, the screens flickering with the footage of my life. I'd always felt like I was being watched, but to see it laid out like this, like he had been there, lurking in the background all along, was too much to bear. "You don't need to be afraid," Mr. Harris continued, his voice smooth and patient, as though explaining something simple. "I've been protecting you, Claire, keeping you safe from the dangers you couldn't even begin to understand. You think you're the only one in this neighborhood, in this world, who's been followed, who's been chosen." His words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to scream, but the terror bubbling inside me made my mouth go dry. I glanced at the door, trying to gauge the distance, but it felt miles away. And that's when I noticed something even more horrifying. There was another door, tucked behind a dusty bookshelf in the corner, a door I hadn't seen before. My pulse quickened. If there was one hidden door, who knew what other secrets he'd kept locked away? Before I could gather the courage to make a move, Mr. Harris stepped closer. "You've been special to me, Claire. All these years, I've been waiting for the right time. And now, at last, the time has come." I recoiled, stumbling back as I tried to free myself from his grip. "What do you mean, the right time? What are you talking about?" My voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. He sighed, as though I was the one who didn't understand. "You're perfect, Claire. You've always been perfect. But the world around you, it's dangerous. People like you, they don't last. Not without someone to protect them." His words were chilling, laced with a strange affection, as if he was offering me a gift. "I don't need your protection," I snapped, pulling my arm away with all my strength. But he wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had taken on that faraway, obsessive look, as though he could see something beyond me, something I couldn't understand. He turned toward the door behind the bookshelf, the one I hadn't noticed earlier, and without warning, he unlocked it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the shadows. The air felt cold, and a strange noise, like the rustle of something scurrying in the dark, echoed from below. "I've kept you safe all these years," he said, his voice low and almost reverent. "Now, come with me, Claire. You'll understand soon enough. We have all the time in the world." The thought of following him down that dark staircase made my stomach churn, but what choice did I have? He was still standing between me and the door, blocking my only escape. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, the panic rising inside me, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room for much longer. Reluctantly, I stepped toward the stairs. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light, and as I descended, I could hear Mr. Harris's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, seeing his shadow looming in the dim light. My mind raced, looking for any chance to escape. But the basement was a maze of twisting hallways, and every door we passed seemed to close in on me, each one more suffocating than the last. When we reached the bottom, Mr. Harris led me into a small room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange items. Old books, mementos, and what appeared to be more cameras. But in the center of the room was something far worse. It was a table cluttered with what looked like old maps and notes. And there, in the middle of it all, was a large, unsettling photograph. It was of me, taken from a distance, though it had been doctored, manipulated to show me in places I'd never been. "This is what I've been working for," Mr. Harris said, his voice almost reverent as he gestured to the table. "I've studied everything about you, Claire. Your routines, your habits, the way you move through the world. It's all part of the plan. And now you're finally ready." I backed away slowly, trying to make sense of what he was saying, trying to put the pieces together, but nothing made sense. I had to get out. Panic surged within me as I scanned the room. My heart raced and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure what was worse. The strangeness of Mr. Harris's obsession, or the terrifying realization that everything I'd believed about my life was a lie. I had no idea how long he'd been watching me, no idea how much of my life had been meticulously observed, recorded, and documented. His obsession with me, his insistence that he was protecting me. It was all too much to process. I needed to think clearly. I needed to find a way out. But as Mr. Harris turned toward the table, I noticed something even more unsettling. There were photographs of other people scattered among the maps, some old, some recent, each one with a red X drawn over them. Faces I didn't recognize. Faces frozen in a moment of terror. "What is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. "Why are you doing this?" He glanced back at me, his face twisted into a soft smile, like he was explaining something simple. "They were all like you, Claire, special. But they weren't ready. They couldn't understand, couldn't see what was coming. You're different. You'll see that soon enough." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "I'm not like them," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm not part of your plan. I don't want this." His eyes darkened, and the smile faded, replaced by something colder. "You don't have a choice. You never did. The moment you moved here, you became part of the bigger picture. I've been waiting for this, Claire. For you to realize what's truly happening. The world isn't safe. Not for people like you." His words twisted in my mind like a knife, cutting through everything I thought I knew. What was he talking about? People like me? Was he talking about my family, my history? Or was it something deeper, something more sinister? I didn't have time to process it because, at that moment, I realized something that sent a jolt of terror through me. I wasn't alone. A movement at the corner of my eye caught my attention, and I turned sharply to see the door to the room crack open. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and unnervingly calm, his expression hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to make the air grow thick with tension. Mr. Harris's smile returned, but this time it was colder, more knowing. "Ah, Claire, meet my partner. He's been helping me. Prepare for the next step. You're the final piece of the puzzle." I backed away instinctively, my mind racing for a way out. I had to escape. There was no other choice. But the basement, the locked doors, the cameras, they were all closing in on me. This wasn't just a stranger's obsession. This was something far darker, far more calculated. The man in the corner stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes were empty, devoid of emotion. I didn't know who he was, but in that moment, I realized I couldn't let him get any closer. My survival instincts kicked in, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I bolted. I didn't know where the door to the basement was, but I didn't care. I had to move. My legs carried me as quickly as they could, my body fueled by pure adrenaline. I could hear Mr. Harris's voice calling after me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The air in the hallway felt different, colder now, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow passage as I sprinted. I reached the stairs, and without thinking, I raced up them, the door to the outside world almost within reach. But as I reached for the handle, I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, grabbing my arm from behind. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but it wasn't Mr. Harris who had grabbed me. It was the other man. His grip was like iron, and his face, hidden in the shadows of his hood, was like a mask. His eyes were empty, hollow. "No!" I screamed, trying to break free. But his hand tightened, dragging me back into the house. Before I could fight back, I heard a sound from behind me. A loud crash. The front door swung open, slamming against the wall with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. I looked back, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. The door to the outside was wide open, and in the doorway stood someone else. Someone who wasn't part of Mr. Harris's twisted plan. The figure in the doorway was a welcome sight. Someone who wasn't involved in the madness that had consumed Mr. Harris's life. I couldn't see them clearly at first, my vision blurry with panic and fear, but the sound of heavy footsteps brought clarity. The person was tall, athletic, and exuded an air of authority that made my chest tighten with hope. I didn't know who they were, but I knew they were my only chance. "Claire, move," the stranger shouted, their voice sharp and commanding. The tone left no room for hesitation, and I didn't waste a second. With every ounce of strength, I broke free from the man's iron grip and bolted toward the door, not looking back. My legs were burning, but I didn't care. I had one goal in mind: freedom. The stranger stepped forward and grabbed the man who had been dragging me back, throwing him off balance with a force that I could never have imagined. I barely registered the commotion as I stumbled through the open doorway, my feet hitting the ground outside with a rush of relief. I didn't stop running. The night air hit me like a wave, cool and sharp against my skin, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the struggle behind me. Loud grunts and the sound of fists colliding with flesh. But I couldn't afford to look back. I had to get out. I had to keep moving. I darted across the yard, past the dark shadows of the trees that seemed to stretch toward me like skeletal hands, their branches swaying in the wind. My breath was ragged, my mind racing. Where was I supposed to go? I didn't know the area well enough to find safety, but I couldn't stay out here, not with them hunting me. The stranger, the one who had come to my rescue, was a blur of motion behind me, their footsteps echoing in the distance as they followed me. "Claire, stop. You're not safe yet." They were still calling to me, but I couldn't stop now. Not until I was far away from that house. I turned the corner of the yard, my eyes scanning the darkened street ahead, and there it was. Another house, a light on in the window. A safe place. I didn't know whose house it was, but it didn't matter. I couldn't stay in the woods. I could hear the man's voice again, faint but growing closer. He was still after me. I sprinted down the street, the glow of the streetlights providing some semblance of comfort, but even they couldn't erase the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't know if Mr. Harris and his accomplice had a network of people who were working with them, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. Finally, I reached the porch of the house with the light on. I banged on the door, my fists pounding against the wood in desperation. "Please, help me," I screamed. My voice was raw, but I didn't care. I needed someone to hear me, someone to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. The door swung open, revealing an older woman, her face creased with concern. She looked at me, then at the street behind me, and her expression hardened. "You're running from them, aren't you?" she said, her voice low but steady. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. "Come inside, quickly." I didn't hesitate. I rushed inside, and she shut the door behind me with a soft click. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. The woman looked at me carefully, as though weighing her next words. "I know who they are, Claire, and I know what they want." Her gaze softened with something that almost resembled pity. You're safe for now, but not for long. They won't stop until they get what they want." I stared at her, my mind reeling with the enormity of everything she was saying. "How do you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window. "Because they've done this before, to others. They've been watching you for a long time." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the weight of her words sank in. The woman moved toward a table near the window and pulled out a small stack of papers, handing them to me. "Take these. They're your only chance. You can't stay here for long. They'll be looking for you." I looked down at the papers, my mind still racing. The words blurred in front of me, but there was one thing I understood. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for my very existence. The door to the house rattled suddenly, and I froze. The woman's eyes widened. She grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the back door, motioning for silence. "They're here," she whispered. My pulse thundered in my ears as the woman led me through the dimly lit house. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, as if every creak in the floorboards echoed through the walls. She pulled me toward the back door, her grip firm around my wrist. I didn't question her. I couldn't afford to. Every second was crucial. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, came from the front of the house. I could hear muffled voices, too faint to make out, but I knew exactly who they were. Mr. Harris, the partner. They were here, and they were closing in. "Don't make a sound," the woman whispered urgently, her breath shallow with fear. "They'll know if you panic. Just stay calm and do as I say." I nodded, my throat dry, my hands shaking. She gave me a small smile, trying to reassure me, but there was no hiding the worry in her eyes. She was terrified too. Her house, her sanctuary, wasn't going to protect us much longer. She opened the back door, and we stepped into the yard. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. I glanced back at the house, my stomach churning. Was anyone still inside? Had they found the woman? I didn't know, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. "Come on," she urged, pulling me toward the edge of the property, where a dense patch of woods lay. "We can hide in there. They won't be able to follow us without losing time." I hesitated. The woods were dark, thick with trees that seemed to close in on themselves, but there was no time to weigh the risks. The sound of footsteps was growing louder. Mr. Harris and his accomplice were getting closer. We had to move. We darted into the woods, the underbrush crackling beneath our feet. I tried to keep pace with the woman, but my legs felt heavy, my mind clouded with fear. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made my heart race, but I pushed it down. I had to focus. I had to keep moving. The woman led me deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees with a sense of purpose. She moved like someone who knew these woods well, her footsteps silent as she guided me through the darkness. I had no idea how far we were from the house, but I didn't care. As long as we were away from them, I could breathe again. We reached a small clearing, and the woman paused. She turned to me, her face illuminated by the pale light of the moon. "We need to wait here for now," she said, her voice low. "It'll be safe for a while. They won't find us in this spot." I nodded, sinking to the ground. My body felt like lead, every muscle aching from the tension. I tried to steady my breath, but it was hard. The weight of everything, the house, the cameras, the recordings, Mr. Harris's obsession, crushed me. How could I go back to my life after this? How could I ever feel safe again? The woman sat down beside me, her presence oddly comforting despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "You're not alone, Claire," she said softly. "You never were. I've been watching you too. I've been keeping an eye on Harris and his partner for years." I looked at her, confused. You've been watching me." She nodded. "Yes, I knew they'd come for you eventually. They always do. But you're different, Claire. You have a strength I didn't expect. That's why you're still alive." I shook my head, trying to process what she was saying. "But I don't understand. Why didn't you help me sooner?" She sighed, her gaze distant as though lost in her own thoughts. "I couldn't, not until I was sure you were ready. Harris's plan, his obsession, it's been years in the making. I couldn't risk getting involved until I knew you had the strength to fight back." I felt a pang of guilt mixed with frustration. I should have been stronger. I should have seen the signs earlier, but I hadn't. I hadn't known anything about Harris or his twisted scheme. Suddenly, the woman grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. Her eyes were wide with alarm. "Listen," she said urgently. "We don't have much time. They're closing in on us. We need to move." I stood, my legs unsteady, but the adrenaline was already coursing through me again. I didn't know what was coming next, but I had no choice but to follow her. As we slipped through the trees, I couldn't help but feel the weight of Mr. Harris's obsession, still lingering like a dark shadow. The woman's hand tightened around mine, her grip solid and reassuring. For the first time in days, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. I didn't know where we were going or what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. We would survive. And no matter what, we would make sure they never found us again. Months had passed since I escaped that nightmare. The police had conducted their investigation, but no trace of Mr. Harris or his partner was ever found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only the remnants of their twisted obsession behind. The woman who had helped me, whose name I learned was Evelyn, had disappeared as well, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of gratitude and confusion. I moved far away, seeking peace and distance from the house I had once called home. The memories of that place haunted me, but the further I got, the less I felt their weight. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, hearing the faintest sound of footsteps outside my window. But I learned to ignore them, to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I found a new life, one that didn't revolve around fear and paranoia. I made friends, started over, and tried to rebuild the pieces of myself that had been shattered. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, there were always whispers in the back of my mind. Of the cameras, of the recordings, of the dark obsession that had once controlled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every new place I settled in, every new town I moved to, I would catch someone's gaze lingering a bit too long, or I would notice something just slightly out of place. It wasn't enough to make me panic, but it was enough to keep me on edge. One evening, while unpacking in yet another new apartment, I found an old photograph tucked into the back of a drawer. It was a picture of me from the days before everything changed. My heart skipped a beat. The photo had been taken at a time I didn't remember, in a place I had never been. There was no mistaking it. It was Mr. Harris's handwriting on the back, waiting for the right moment. I stood there for a long time, staring at the picture. A chill crept down my spine, and I realized something I had tried so desperately to ignore. No matter where I went, I could never truly escape. Mr. Harris had always been watching. He was always one step ahead, and he had never stopped. I kept the photo, not out of fear, but as a reminder. A reminder that no one could ever truly escape their past, that the darkest parts of our lives would follow us no matter how far we ran. This story happened a while back. I was 15 or 16 at the time and was a member of a youth group. I won't share the real name for privacy's sake. Normally, we'd gather on Saturday afternoons and have some fun playing games organized by the older members in charge. But this time, we stayed the whole weekend, Saturday morning until Sunday afternoon. I was in the oldest group, with 3 others, 2 of whom were a year younger than my friend and me. We had a great day on Saturday, playing different games with the younger kids, etc. When night came, we were allowed to stay up longer, so we sat around the campfire with our leaders and just chilled. It was getting late, and the 2 younger ones went to sleep. They just watched YouTube all night. My friend and I, who were about the same age, were talking when he suddenly hinted that we could basically do anything we wanted. Most of the leaders were asleep or just assumed we wouldn't do anything stupid. So he started talking about this abandoned vacation home for schools from a big city. I'm a fervent urbexer, so this piqued my interest. We were located next to the sea, so it was common for larger, more inland cities to have places where schools could come to enjoy the ocean. But this one had been abandoned for some reason. That's how we ended up going for a walk around 11:30 p.m. for about an hour and a half. We had to travel through some forest paths, which eventually led us to a big road in a nice neighborhood. At the end of the road, there was a large, sinister-looking building. The city lights made it appear yellowish, and all the windows were broken. I noticed that pretty much all the entrances were boarded up and asked my friend how we could even get in. That's when he told me there was a way through some dunes that connected a couple of roads. I asked how he knew this, and he said he had spent a lot of time there having fun. He also mentioned there was a squatter living there, but everyone in the area knew him, and he even talked to the man sometimes. We hopped a gate and entered the complex through some broken doors. By then, it was already midnight, so we had to use our phone flashlights to see. The floor was covered in rubble and broken glass, and it smelled moldy. Each room was dark and humid. I could only see about 5 meters in front of me. I was pretty scared, but tried to man up and follow my friend. We made our way up to the 3rd floor via the first stairwell because that was where my friend and his friends used to hang out. You could tell they spent time there. There was less rubble, it smelled like fireworks, and there was some trash like cans and chips on the floor. We had some fun adventuring. It was a great time. All of a sudden, I found myself completely alone. I stood still and heard a banging noise from a room farther down the hall. Hesitant and pretty scared, I went to check it out. That's when I saw my friend holding a sink that he had just kicked out of a counter coming out of the room. I was relieved but confused about why he had a sink in his hand. He looked at me and smiled, telling me to follow him. So I did. He led me to a room with broken windows. Almost all the windows in the building were broken, so I wasn't alarmed. Then, my friend had the brilliant idea to throw the sink through a hole in the glass. I watched as it fell 3 floors and shattered on impact. I looked at him, and he had a big smile on his face. I smiled too. In my innocent teen mind, I thought to myself, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. We both laughed loudly, maybe a bit too loudly. Not even a minute later, my friend told me to turn off my flashlight after hearing some noise, plunging us into total darkness. That's when we heard it. A scream so satanic it could hardly be mistaken for human. Yet it was. Our big stunt had woken up the squatter who lived there, and he wasn't too happy about it. We heard him banging and breaking things. My friend and I ran straight to the 2nd stairwell because we knew he'd be at the 1st one. Luckily, most of the building was dimly lit by streetlights. My heart was pounding, but I kept my breathing under control. After years of playing scary hide-and-seek games in the nearby forest at night and doing other things with my friends, I had mastered this. I was terrified, but my thoughts were clear. We had to get out of there. We slowly descended each stair, checking every door, until we reached the 1st floor. But we couldn't go further. A bed, placed up against the stairwell, blocked our path. So we had to go back up to the 2nd floor. That's when I noticed the silence. The dreadful silence. All the banging and screaming had stopped as suddenly as it had started. The squatter was stalking us, making no noise like a predator stalking its prey. It made me more nervous and panicky with each passing second. We quietly made our way to the 1st stairwell and stopped for a while, standing almost perfectly still like statues. The squatter knew we had to get out of there through that exit. It was the only one. I looked up at my friend, and he asked if I was ready to run. I nodded, and we counted to 3. Big breath, 1, 2, 3, go. We both rushed through the stairwell, jumping multiple steps at once. Our hearts were pounding, and every step was calculated to avoid falling or stepping on broken glass or rubble. Finally, we reached the 1st floor. Right through the double doors, there it was. The exit. My legs pushed harder than ever before. The final sprint. I looked back. My friend was right behind me. We jumped through the broken door, leaped the fence, and made a final sprint to the road. It was over. My heart was pounding, my eyes wide, my body stiff. I was standing there in front of my friend, with the biggest smile ever. That's when I became addicted to adrenaline. Nothing could satisfy me more than that feeling. We walked back to the campsite, and nobody asked us anything. Since then, I've told this story countless times to others, and I've even gone back to the home. I may have been a bit too scared or paranoid at the time, but it was an unforgettable moment. A story I can share with others. I was really innocent and naive back then, I know. A lot of people wouldn't even have dared to step foot in that building, but I did. And it created a friendship and a story I'll never forget. I was scared out of my mind, though. That's true. I didn't expect much from this weekend. With finals just around the corner, I figured it would be a quiet few days spent in my apartment, diving into textbooks, trying to catch up on assignments I'd let slide. My name's Daniel, and I'm a college student in my 2nd year. My place is on the edge of town, in one of those cookie-cutter apartment complexes where the walls are thin, and the sounds at night seemed to get amplified. It's a far cry from the hustle and bustle of the city center, but that's exactly why I chose it. Peace, quiet, and the space to focus. I'm not a huge fan of big social gatherings or loud parties, which is good because the other students here aren't the type to keep things low-key. Most weekends, they're out with friends or back home visiting family, which means I get the place to myself, and that's the way I like it. But something strange started happening a few days ago. At first, it was just a tap, tap, tap on my door. A soft knock, almost as if someone was trying to get my attention without making much noise. I assumed it was some kind of prank, maybe one of my neighbors playing a joke. I'd heard about stuff like that happening before. Students bored out of their minds, finding ways to get a laugh. I didn't think much of it at first. The knocking continued though, and it wasn't just once a day. It happened late at night, usually around 10 or 11, when I was deep into studying. It would come in bursts. 3 or 4 knocks, then silence. I'd open the door, and no one would be there. Not a soul in sight. At first, I'd chalked it up to my imagination, or perhaps an errant student knocking and running. But the pattern began to form, and that's when things started getting unsettling. On the 4th night, I was sitting on the couch, trying to focus on a particularly tedious chapter of a history book when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. I glanced up, feeling a chill creep down my spine. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it quickly. Nothing. No one. Not even a footprint in the hallway. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, casting an eerie glow over the dark corridor. I shut the door, chalking it up to a prank again. But that was the first time I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I made a note to talk to the building manager the next day, though I doubted she'd have any answers. As far as I knew, I was the only one in this part of the building who wasn't away for the weekend. But even with that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was just a nagging sensation, something that made me glance over my shoulder every now and then. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere in my apartment felt off. The next evening, while I was eating dinner, it happened again. A loud crash. It echoed from down the hall, a violent sound that made me nearly drop my fork. I stood up and rushed to the door, flinging it open, expecting to find someone in the hallway. But there was nothing, just a faint smell of something metallic like rust. At the end of the hall, one of the apartment doors was ajar, the lock completely busted. My heart skipped a beat when I saw which apartment it was. Linda's. I'd only seen her a handful of times. She was always quiet, always kept to herself. The door to her apartment was normally locked, and she didn't seem to socialize much. I didn't know much about her, but I'd never had any reason to suspect her. But seeing her door broken, wide open, in a way that seemed deliberate, sent a shiver down my spine. I thought about calling the building manager, but I didn't. Instead, I just closed my door and went back to dinner, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. The knock didn't come the next night, or the night after that. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that hung over me like a dark cloud, but the quiet only seemed to make everything worse. The more I tried to focus on my studies, the more I felt like I was being pulled into a strange, surreal world. One where I wasn't entirely in control. By the time Friday rolled around, I had mostly convinced myself that the knocks were just a figment of my imagination. Maybe I was stressed from finals, overthinking everything. But that all changed when I got a text message late in the afternoon. The message was simple. "You're doing well today. Keep it up. Don't let the pressure get to you." It was a weird thing to receive. I didn't recognize the number. No name, no context. Just that strange sentence. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who could possibly know that I'd been feeling pressure from finals? It was just a generic message, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was alone here. No one knew what I was going through, not in such specific terms. Not unless they were watching me. The paranoia set in quickly after that. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was monitoring me. Someone who had access to my life in ways I couldn't explain. My mind raced, and I found myself checking my phone for more messages, but there was nothing else. Just silence. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to sleep off the unease that had settled deep in my chest. But sleep didn't come. I lay there for hours, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Linda and her broken door. There was something wrong about that, something off. I tried to put it out of my mind, but it kept coming back, tugging at me like a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. Eventually, I decided to get up and check things out. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and quietly crept to the door. I figured I'd just take a look around the hallway, maybe see if there were any signs of forced entry, anything that would explain the odd feeling. My heart raced with every step, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I made it to the end of the hallway where Linda's apartment was. The door was still open, but now there was something different about it. The smell of metal, almost like blood, was stronger. I could hear faint sounds coming from inside. Distant, muffled voices that didn't belong in the otherwise empty building. My breath caught in my throat. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. Another message. I read it quickly. I see you. I felt my stomach twist. My head spun with confusion and fear. Was someone watching me from the shadows? Someone who had been here the whole time? I walked toward the apartment, slowly, my feet dragging with every step. I couldn't stop myself. Something compelled me to keep going. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet. No one was there. But then I noticed something strange on the ceiling. A tiny black dot, almost imperceptible. A camera. My heart nearly stopped. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was small, almost invisible, tucked away in a corner where the light met the wall. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been inside my apartment. And then it hit me. The messages. The knocks. The surveillance. Linda wasn't just some quiet neighbor. She was watching me. She knew what I was doing, where I went, what I ate for lunch. I stumbled backward, feeling the walls closing in. It wasn't just the apartment that was a trap. It was me. The camera, that little black dot, was like a curse, hanging over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't look at it without feeling the weight of its presence. Whoever had placed it there had been watching me for God knows how long, cataloging my every move. But it wasn't just that. It was the messages, the knocks, the broken door. Everything was connected, and it all led back to Linda. My mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. I had to know more. I had to find out who Linda really was. I had to understand what was happening to me before it was too late. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to confront her. I couldn't keep running from this. But what was I supposed to say? How could I ask her why she was spying on me without sounding insane? I decided to start with the basics. I searched for her name online, hoping to find some kind of record, something that would explain her behavior. At first, it seemed like there was nothing. Linda wasn't a common name, but there were no results that jumped out at me. I tried a few variations, adding her building's name, her apartment number. Nothing. I even checked social media, but she had no online presence. It was like she didn't exist outside this building. My heart sank as I realized I was getting nowhere. That's when I remembered something I'd overheard a few months ago, when I first moved in. A conversation between two of the other tenants. They'd mentioned that Linda had only recently moved into the building. She was quiet, never made waves, and never really spoke to anyone. There was something strange about her, they'd said, but nothing concrete. No one had ever really questioned her presence. I pushed back from my desk, rubbing my eyes. This wasn't getting me anywhere. I needed something more. I needed proof. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched gnawed at me, a constant hum at the back of my mind. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all. The phone buzzing again broke my concentration. Another message. You're getting closer, Daniel, but you're still not seeing the whole picture. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just some random prank. Whoever was doing this was toying with me, pushing me toward a truth I wasn't ready for. I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone, dialed the building manager's number, and waited. Hello? Her voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. Hey, this is Daniel from 3A. I need to talk to you about Linda, the woman who lives in 2B. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Linda, what about her? I think she's been spying on me, I said, my voice shaking despite myself. I think she has a camera in my apartment. I need to know more about her. The manager sighed heavily. Daniel, I can't give you personal information about other tenants. But if you're concerned, I can check into it. I'll see if there's anything unusual with her records. But you have to understand she's been here for a while, and there's never been any complaints about her behavior. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I wasn't getting anywhere. But then she said something that made me freeze. "There's one thing I can tell you," she continued. "Linda, her records are a bit strange. She doesn't have a lot of history before moving here. It's like she just appeared." That was it. That one sentence, that one admission, sent a chill down my spine. Linda didn't have a past, and that made everything so much worse. As I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of the situation crash down on me. I wasn't just dealing with a creepy neighbor. I was dealing with someone who had no past, no identity, and no reason to be in this building. Whoever she was playing a game, and I was the target. The walls felt like they were closing in around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead lights made my heart race faster. I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was always one step ahead, watching me waiting. It was like I was trapped in a game, and the rules were being written as we went along. But the worst part, I didn't know if I could trust anyone. The building manager had barely said anything useful, and even her admission about Linda's mysterious past only left me more confused and scared. I spent the next few days trying to find some kind of connection, some thread to pull that would unravel the mystery. I searched through local news archives looking for anything that could explain Linda's sudden appearance in this town, this apartment complex. But everything I found only deepened the hole I was falling into. There were no records, no incidents, no reports of anyone matching Linda's description. It was like she had materialized out of thin air, placed here for some reason I couldn't fathom. In a desperate attempt to find out more, I started watching the surveillance footage from the building. It was difficult to get access, but after a bit of persistence, I convinced the security office to let me review the tapes. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, to see if anyone had been messing with the cameras, or if there was something I'd missed. What I found, though, made my blood run cold. The tapes showed Linda entering my apartment twice. Both times I was out. Once when I went for a walk in the park, and another when I'd gone to the library to study. It was subtle, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it, but there she was, entering my place with a key. I had no idea how she had gotten it, and I didn't want to know. She was calm, almost methodical, as she moved through my apartment. It was like she knew exactly where to go, where to look. She was in and out in less than 10 minutes each time, but it was long enough to make me sick. I watched the footage over and over again, trying to make sense of it. Why? Why would she do this? What did she want from me? There were no answers, just more questions piling up in my mind. I knew I had to confront her. I couldn't keep running from this. But I didn't know if I was ready for whatever answers she'd give. It was late one night when I finally decided to do it. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the footage once more, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open in the hallway. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew that sound. The same sound I'd heard countless times before. The same sound that had kept me awake at night, wondering what was going on in this building. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I could ignore it now. This was it. This was the moment I had to confront her. I grabbed my phone, texted my friend Ryan, telling him I was going to check on something, just in case things went wrong, and then I left my apartment. The hallway was dark and empty, the only light coming from the faint glow of the exit signs at either end of the corridor. I walked down the hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached Linda's door, I hesitated. I could hear something faint inside, a shuffle of movement. She was there. She had to be. I knocked 3 times, my hand shaking with anticipation and fear. The door creaked open slowly, just a crack. And there she was, Linda. Standing in the doorway, her face expressionless, as if she were expecting me. Her eyes didn't seem surprised, didn't seem frightened, just calm, too calm. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and smooth, "I knew you'd come." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the jumbled thoughts, the shock. What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. She smiled faintly. "I've been watching you for months, Daniel. Everything you do, everything you think. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." My heart stopped. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I didn't understand, but somehow I knew it was too late to back down. Linda stepped aside, inviting me into the apartment with a calm gesture, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there before it was too late, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't move. I had to know what she was planning. I had to understand why she'd been following me, watching me, like I was some kind of prize to be claimed. She closed the door softly behind me, and I noticed that the inside of her apartment was pristine. Almost unnaturally so. It looked like a showroom, empty and cold, with nothing but the bare essentials. A couch, a coffee table, a single lamp. No personal touches, no photographs or mementos. Just sterile, calculated space. And there, in the center of it all, was a large corkboard mounted on the wall. I had to fight the urge to turn and leave. But I didn't. Instead, my eyes were drawn to the board, where pieces of paper were pinned to it. Photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. And right in the center, my face, my name. The entire board seemed to revolve around me. Every detail of my life, every decision, every movement, was meticulously documented. "You've been a fascinating subject, Daniel," Linda said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "You're the one who stood out. The one who didn't just blend in. I've watched you long enough to know what makes you tick. How you think. How you react. And it's beautiful, really." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What the hell is this? What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, but I couldn't stop myself from demanding an answer. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and I needed to wake up from it. Linda didn't seem perturbed by my outburst. She simply smiled again, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I want you to understand, Daniel. I'm not just here to observe. I'm here because I see potential in you. You're different. You'll make a perfect addition to the collection." I didn't know what she meant by collection, but I was starting to get an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. Everything in me screamed to leave, but I couldn't pull away. "What collection? What are you talking about?" She turned slowly toward the corkboard and gestured to the photographs. "These are my past projects. I've been doing this for years. Watching, waiting, picking the right ones. It's not personal, you know. It's just how I work." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Past projects. The board wasn't just a record of my life. It was a trophy case, a memorial to the victims who had been part of her twisted obsession. And I was next. "You're not the first, Daniel," she continued, her voice almost too soft. "I've had many others. People who didn't see it coming. They never do. But you're different. I wanted to wait longer before I made my move. See how you would handle it. And now, well." She trailed off, her gaze lingering on me with unnerving intensity. "Now I know you're ready." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees wobbled, and I fought the urge to collapse right there on the floor. I had been living in a house of lies, surrounded by her watching eyes, and I hadn't even known. She had been waiting, observing every detail of my life, plotting every step. And now I was her next victim. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could form another word, I heard a noise from the hallway. A soft shuffling sound, a voice whispering my name. A chill ran through me, and I felt my stomach drop. Linda didn't seem to notice. She just stepped closer to the corkboard, running her fingers over the photos. "You're so close to the end, Daniel. Just one more step, and you'll be a part of the collection too. It's inevitable." I knew I had to act. My mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, for a way out of this nightmare. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could reach it, the hallway light flickered. And then the door slammed open behind me, and I froze. Standing there, blocking my escape, was Linda's face, twisted in a cruel grin. "Where do you think you're going, Daniel?" she asked softly. "You can't leave now. You've already made it this far. It's too late to turn back." I froze. My body felt heavy, like I was moving underwater, every second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Linda's figure loomed in the doorway, her smile never faltering. She was no longer just the strange neighbor I had suspected, but a dangerous predator, and I was the prey she had been preparing for. I felt the air grow thicker, suffocating me with her presence. My mind raced. I need to escape. I need to do something. But what? Every avenue seemed blocked. The door, the hallway, Linda's gaze. It all felt like a trap that was closing in on me with each breath I took. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Linda's hand moved, just a small, fluid motion, and I noticed a glint of metal in her palm. A small knife, its blade sharp and reflective under the dim light of the hallway. She hadn't been planning on talking. She had been waiting for the right moment to end this. I took a step back, my shoes scraping against the wooden floor. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My body was locked in place, too terrified to move. I couldn't let her get to me. I couldn't let her win. "Don't worry, Daniel," she said, her voice like honey, sweet and deceptively soft. "You won't feel a thing. I've made sure of it." No. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not after everything I had survived, after everything I had uncovered. I wasn't going to let her take me down. I wasn't going to be another name on her twisted collection. In that instant, my fear turned into something else. Something colder. Something more calculated. I glanced over at the corkboard one last time, seeing all those faces staring back at me. I wasn't going to be one of them. I couldn't be. I lunged forward, my hand grabbing the nearest object I could find. An old chair that was sitting abandoned against the wall. I swung it toward Linda, knocking the knife from her hand as she staggered back in shock. My breath came in ragged gasps, adrenaline surging through my veins. This was my chance. "Get away from me," I shouted, desperation and rage flooding through me. Linda raised her arms, trying to shield herself, but I didn't stop. I swung the chair again, slamming it into her, forcing her back until she collided with the wall. For a split second, I thought I had her. She was dazed, off balance, and I took that moment to run. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears I could barely hear myself think. I dashed for the door, kicking it open with all my strength. I couldn't stop now. I had to get out of the building. I had to get somewhere safe. I raced down the hallway, my mind a blur of fear and desperation. Behind me, I could hear her footsteps, her voice calling after me in a distorted, almost sing-song way. "You can't escape, Daniel. You're already mine." I didn't turn back. I couldn't. If I looked over my shoulder, I would break. I would lose my resolve, and that couldn't happen. I pushed open the back exit door, stumbling out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. For a moment, I just stood there, blinking into the darkness. My body was trembling, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But I wasn't dead. I was still alive. I had escaped. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen as I dialed 911. I couldn't think clearly, but I knew I had to. She was still in there, somewhere in that building, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and steady, but I could hear the panic in my own voice as I told her everything. "There's a woman," I gasped. "She's been stalking me. I think she's going to kill me. You need to send help. Now." My phone slipped from my hand, and I fell to my knees, my head spinning. The sound of sirens in the distance was a welcome relief. But as the night air grew colder, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And I was never truly safe. The police arrived moments later, sweeping through the building with trained efficiency. Linda was taken into custody, but it didn't feel like a victory. The images of that corkboard, those faces of the victims, haunted me long after the authorities had left. I would never be the same again. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I couldn't live in that building, knowing what had happened. I packed up what little I had left and left town without a word. No goodbyes. Just escape. I needed to forget, to run far away from Linda and the nightmare she had dragged me into. I figured I'd post another story that just recently came back up in conversation with my friends and I. I might have posted something regarding this thing before in more detail, but I don't remember. If I have, I'll link the post somewhere. If not, I'll have to tell that story another time. For context, when I was little, my family lived in a 2-room apartment with 2 bathrooms, one in the master bedroom, and one in the hallway, a kitchen, and a living room. There was also a balcony that had those long, flexible, sliding blinds that hang down vertically from their track. My bedroom was just across from the guest and hallway bathroom. My parents' room was at the end of the hallway, and on the other end was the kitchen, which was on the right-hand side facing toward the master bedroom. On the left side, there was a small space for a table, and behind the table was the sliding balcony door. The living room occupied the rest of that space. The layout of this apartment is important to this part of the story, so please keep it in mind. I spent the first 3 years of my life in that apartment, and during that time my parents claimed to have witnessed things moving on their own, things they just put down on the center of tables rolling or sliding off of the flat surfaces, or the vertical blinds falling off of the track without any kind of influence. The most chilling thing from that time that my parents have both told me was that I had an imaginary friend who I'd named Elmo. Elmo was extremely tall, tall enough that his back would be against the wall and all red. According to my dad, I would often talk to myself. When asked who I was talking to, I would reply stating that I was talking to this imaginary friend. When things were put in the wrong places, I'd say Elmo did it. If things fell off the table, Elmo did it. If the TV was left on at night, Elmo did it. Despite these creepy occurrences, nobody really batted an eye until the same year we left that apartment. I remember vivid nightmares, a story for another time, and sleep paralysis episodes I had at a very young age, and a distinct fear of the bathroom across the hall from my room. My little brother also would refuse to use that bathroom alone, even in the daytime. Our guess is he saw something in there much like I had in my own room at the same age. By the end of that year, my parents had decided it was best for us to move. My father even admitted to having the home blessed before we moved out, which is saying a lot since he's normally not superstitious or paranormal believer. He holds the same belief I do, where we don't believe in the paranormal unless it shows itself to us. The fact that my father felt the need to have the apartment blessed before we moved out really makes me wonder what was there to influence that decision, but I digress. Now that the major context is out of the way, here's the part that came up recently. I was babysitting my youngest brother at my grandma's house. My dad's a single parent now, and so he often needs breaks from watching my youngest brother to take important meeting calls, so either myself or my grandma will take over that role. At the time he was either 4 or 5. He's on the autism spectrum, and as a result, especially back then, he had a hard time communicating in full sentences. He still was, and is able to get his points across with somewhat fuller sentences, but at the time he would only say 1 or 2 words at most. This particular day, I was entirely home alone watching him until my grandma got there to take over. Normally one of my aunts would be there, but this particular day it was just my brother and I. At some point, he got very upset and began trying to block off the hallway that my grandma's bathroom was in. Her hallway closet and pantry door both open outward, and you can cover the hallway with the doors. At first, I tried to get him away from the doors and move him to the living room, which was closer to the front door so I could investigate. I got my knife from my bag and had him wait in the living room as I went to see what could have scared him. I checked every inch of the bathroom, all 3 bedrooms in that hallway, the closets, the bathroom and the master bedroom, everything. I couldn't figure out what spooked him. Despite not finding anything remotely threatening as I searched, I just felt really uneasy. That could of course be written off as paranoia due to the situation of me, a teenage girl, alone in a house with a boy who's getting scared about something in a dim hallway with 4 rooms and 2 closets, but the feeling was eerie nonetheless. When my grandma got home, I of course asked if my brother had done this before while she was watching him, and to my surprise, she said yes. She told me he'd been getting scared and saying there was a monster in his room at night. Of course, she also brought up how he was the same age my brother and I were when we saw, who I suspect was the imaginary friend Elmo, and reminded me that my grandpa, who was a religious leader of sorts in her church, was the one who blessed the apartment before we moved. Later on, I brought this experience up to my dad, who also agreed the situation was similar to what happened when we lived in that apartment all those years ago. He'd also told me that my mom had seen a tall figure as well throughout her life and my childhood. However, we also wrote that off as her being high on something, since she was on substances for the majority of the time I've been alive. Either way, I find the whole situation just incredibly unnerving regardless of if it's some kind of spirit or just some hallucination my whole family seems to be prone to seeing. Whatever the case is, I hope nothing like what happened that night happens when I have to watch my brother overnight this upcoming Tuesday. Wish me luck. I'll keep you updated if a ghost comes to visit while I'm home alone then. To be continued. A suburban lifestyle can get a little boring. Similar-looking houses. The tranquility of the streets seem to not be affected by anything other than an occasional car horn. kids playing soccer in the front yard. But no binge drinking at 2 in the morning, going to a gala at an art gallery, or clubbing at a discounted music venue. As a man in his early 30s, I reckoned it was time to settle down when I inherited a small house in the suburban area from my grandparents. I was not complaining. I was sick of living paycheck to paycheck, unable to juggle between paying for rent or saving up. But this new life was also a little boring, to say the least. I was craving something interesting in my life. Some spark. That was it. That's when I noticed a young couple that recently moved in. Their house was right across from mine. They didn't seem anything out of ordinary. They kept it to themselves and did not seem to bother anyone else. To be fair, I barely interacted with any of them, which meant that I had no idea what they were really like. But they were young, and it was rather rare to see homeowners so young in my neighborhood. I had millions of questions. What was their reason for staying here? What did they do for work? Did they have kids? I decided I would try befriending them if I could. Get to know more about my neighbors. That seemed to align with my idea of having a little spark in my life. Slow but steady, that was it. It was a Friday evening. I walked over to their front porch. It was a standard house with standard decoration. There was a minimalistic mat in front of the door that read, "Have a good day." Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said. I heard shuffling within the house. They must be organizing their new furniture or sweeping the floor, I thought nonchalantly. "Hello, is anyone there?" I knocked on the door. A pause. There was silence. But it was a silence that felt a little strange to me. I did not hear a voice or anything. Not a "Hey, can you go check the door?" Just an abrupt silence. It was as if whoever was inside paused what they were doing immediately and was waiting. Waiting for what? "I am your neighbor, Steve. I wanted to introduce myself." I paused for a minute. I knew someone was in there. Something did not feel too right, but I internally laughed at myself. A lot of people make it seem like they are not at home when strangers come in front of their house. It was perfectly normal. I decided to count to 10 and then leave when I heard the doorknob turn. "Hi, Steve, nice to meet you." A perfectly ordinary-looking man in his early 30s greeted me with a smile. He had a buzz cut that was a little too short and was wearing a pair of round glasses that was crooked on one end. He looked very calm, as if there was nothing that happened beforehand, and he merely stood up after sitting on a sofa. "My name is also Steve. How's it going?" "Wow, same name. Doing good. Just wanted to swing by and introduce myself. It's fairly rare to see someone so young move into this neighborhood." Yes, that is true. That is true." The neighbor smiled, but I was not sure if he wanted to continue on with this topic or not. "Hey, I was wondering, are you free tomorrow evening? I want to invite you two over for dinner at my place. I thought it would be fun. With some alcohol, too." I winked. I don't know why I winked, but I guess I wanted to keep the mood a little lighthearted. It felt a little tense. The other Steve was staring at me very intently. He was so calm just a minute ago. What was he on about? "Of course, Steve." The neighbor spoke. There was a pause of about 10 seconds. I did not know whether to stare at him back or look at the ground. "But we don't want you to prepare all the food. How about a potluck? We will bring some food and we can all share. Do you have any dietary restrictions? Any meat that you avoid eating?" "I like all kinds of food, Steve. I would appreciate it." "That's perfect." The neighbor smiled, showing his perfectly white, pearly teeth. "We will see you tomorrow. It was nice meeting you, Steve." "Same goes for you." I walked back to my house, unsure whether it was a good interaction or not. The other Steve was definitely polite, but there was something a little uncanny about him that he could not put a finger on. Maybe it was his stare. The intensity of it made it unreal. I shook my head. I was bothered by the smallest things. Meditation. Journaling. I needed to stop watching horror movies in my free time. Binging Get Out the day before was definitely not a good idea. That night, I was tumbling around the bed, unable to sleep. I was thinking about a lot of things. My career, my mundane life, yada yada. But I was also thinking about the interaction I had with the other Steve just earlier. I was wondering to myself if it was the right decision to invite him over for dinner. I stood up and looked over the window. The neighbor's house was bright as if all the lights were turned on. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. All the other houses in the vicinity were dark as usual. Then, momentarily, all the lights turned off. Stillness. The night continued on. Welcome, welcome. I prepared some pork chops with mashed potato and arugula salad. I placed the dishes on the dinner table. Steve and his wife were at the front door. Steve's wife looked like a typical woman in her early 30s. She was wearing a black overcoat with a red turtleneck underneath. Her slim hands were covered in white gloves that almost resembled surgical gloves. Fashion trends nowadays can be so subtle, I thought. She was not wearing any glasses, but her look was oddly similar to her husband's. They both looked like medical professionals, but without the warmth of a family doctor. You can keep the shoes on, I don't mind. The couple smiled at me and entered the house. Hello, my name is Steve. Nice to meet you. Instead of shaking my hand, the wife smiled again and nodded. She is a little quiet. Don't mind her. Here, we brought some food. From a side bag, the other Steve took out 3 black plastic containers. He laid them out on the dinner table, ever so gently to the point where I wondered if there was jewelry inside. Once they were on the table, the neighbor stood there quietly looking at the containers with a smile indicating how proud he was. Proud of what? Do you want to eat or have a glass of wine first? I have some vintage wine you might want to try. Here, take a look. As I was walking to the wine cellar, I felt a gaze behind me. I looked back. No, that's fine. Let's eat first. You must be famished, the other Steve said. The intensity of the neighbor's look felt like a déjà vu. I nodded. Sure, we can eat first. I will serve the food. I guarantee you have not had this before. The neighbor looked at him with a big, warm smile. For the first time since meeting him, the neighbor seemed genuine, kind even. I could feel the enthusiasm radiating from him. I smiled back, sure thing. The wife walked to the dinner table, her boots not making a sound as she took her steps. When she arrived at the dinner table, she looked intently at the containers and immediately yet slowly began to remove the lid, one by one. I was ready to be blown away. Gold flaked steak, foie gras. But what lay in front of me was rather a disappointment compared to my expectation. The first dish was a brisket-type meat that seemed to have been slow-cooked for hours. The meat looked tender, but seemed to have lost the shape of what it originally looked like. The second dish was some sort of stewed meat with raw onions on the side. The third dish was a sausage. A single piece of sausage that was boiled, not grilled. All in all, the food did not look too appetizing to me. Here, try them. I guarantee you have not tried this meat before, the other Steve repeated himself. I nodded awkwardly and sat down. I looked back at the neighbors. They were standing still, their eyes fixated on the brisket meat that was on my fork. I did not feel too great. Hey, you guys can sit down. Don't just stand there. The couple did not move an inch. They continued to stare at me. I took a bite. It tasted like meat. There was not much flavor, but was not bad either. But as I was chewing, I noticed the couple was standing closer and closer to me. Until they were right next to me, staring intently, passionately, deathly. I thought they were looking at the meat, but I was mistaken. They were looking at me. But not at my face. They were looking into my body, my flesh. The meat suddenly tasted rancid. I spit them by reflex. The couple was still looking at me, but this time I swear they were glaring. Their faces did not move, but their hands were shaking. Ever so slightly, so slightly. I did not know what came over me, but I suddenly yelled out. Get out! I don't want you here. The couple did not seem startled. They stood still. I ran towards the door. I swung the door open and pointed at the front porch. Get the hell out of my house, now. The couple looked at one another. then nodded. Slowly but gracefully, they put the lids on the containers, then placed them back in the side bag. They stared at me once, for long, excruciating 15 seconds. Then they began to walk, and walked out of the house. Once I saw that they went back to their house, I ran into the washroom and brushed my teeth vigorously. My instinct told me what was in those containers was something no human was ever supposed to taste. I had no evidence to support any of this, but I could not brush past the gut feeling that was enveloping me. That whole night, I tumbled around, thoughts racing in my mind. Do I call the police about this? But where was the proof? I did not know what the right solution was, and I felt so alone. So alone. In the midst of the night, I peered at the neighbor's house. It was dark tonight. Dark like any other house. This gave me a little comfort. That maybe I was just imagining things. That today was just an odd day. Suddenly, the lights flashed in the house. Blinking, twice. Then darkness. Then silence. Something really creepy is happening across the street. Wasn't sure where to post my experience was directed here from a friend. Wondering what you guys make of this. So about a month ago, the neighbors across the street who have lived there for 25 plus years suddenly packed up and left. No warning, no goodbyes, nothing. Never even saw a for sale sign posted on their lawn. They were an older couple, and I wasn't terribly close with them, but we were friendly enough to say hi and catch up when we caught each other outside. They were good, kind people. I was pretty upset to see them just leave like that. Nearly 3 days after they were gone, a sold sign was put up near the front of the house. I remember thinking how remarkably fast it sold 3 days, and not once did I see an open house or people visiting. Another week or so went by before new neighbors finally moved it. They only arrived with a pretty small U-Haul truck. They hardly had any belongings. The new family that moved in was a middle-aged Asian couple. I remember they came to my house to say hello. They went around our street visiting all the houses to say hello, which I thought was a really nice gesture at the time. They were quiet, but they seemed very nice. Anyway, last night, I was woken up around 2 a.m. by this constant banging sound. Bang, bang, bang. Rhythmic and constant, like the sound of someone slamming a hammer down onto a wooden table over and over. I got out of bed trying to figure out what the noise was or where it was coming from. It took me a few seconds to realize it was coming from outside. I slowly opened my window, which faces the street and my neighbor's house. It was pretty dark out, and I couldn't make out much, but the sound was definitely coming from outside, near the neighbor's house. I live on a cul-de-sac, so to the left of my house is nothing but woods. This would be my neighbor's right-hand side. This is exactly where the sounds were coming from. Deep in the woods. Bang, 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 just over and over again. It never sped up, slowed down, or stopped. Just constant. I'm getting the chills just thinking about it. So I closed the window, thinking the noise will stop eventually. Nope. 10 minutes go by and something outside is still banging. I got back out of bed and opened my window again, trying to look into the darkness and make out what was making the sound. Couldn't see a thing, so I go downstairs, grab a flashlight, and come back upstairs to my room. No way was I going outside. I get to the window, turn on my flashlight, and shine it into the woods. The second the light hits the trees, the banging stops. I mean instantly. Just silence. I remember shivering so hard when that happened. I peered through the opening of my window into the dimly lit woods my light was hitting. Couldn't see anything at all. Just woods and trees. I waited a couple of more minutes and then turned off my light, figuring it must have been an animal or whatever. The banging stopped, so I was fine. As I'm crawling back into bed, bang, bang, bang. I swear to God, I literally just sat there frozen in bed. Can't remember being so creeped out in my life. I don't know what came over me, but I eventually jumped out of bed, opened the window, and yelled out a hey. The banging stopped. The rest of the night, there was no more banging. But it gets weirder. I woke up this morning kind of not thinking about what happened last night, and as I leave my house to go to work, I see it. Deep in the woods, next to my neighbor's house, was a broken down shed I've never seen before. I'm not even sure I would call it a shed. It couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 feet tall, if that, and it was wide enough to fit just a handful of people. The size of the shed wasn't what disturbed me, though. It was how dilapidated it looked, despite never being there before. The shed had 2 front doors with oval windows, and both doors were rusted off and hanging by their hinges. The roof slanted inwards, and the walls were caved in on themselves. It looked like it was about to collapse at any second. That's when I started thinking, what the hell did my neighbors build this last night? At 2 in the morning? The banging noise had to be a hammer or something. But seriously, what the hell? In the middle of the night? So I'm sitting here, writing about this to you guys in my room at 1 in the morning, because it's all I'm thinking about when the banging starts again. It's still banging, I can hear it right now. That's not all though. There's a light coming from the shed now. I can see it from my room, just barely. The banging sounds are coming exactly where the shed is. It's 1 in the morning. I have no idea what the hell is going on. I'm not sure if I should call the police or... Oh God, the banging just stopped. Someone's screaming outside. A few years ago, about a year after my dad got a big promotion at work, my family moved to the suburbs, to a much nicer area of town than where we had lived before. We were all extremely happy with the move, and our quality of life significantly improved. I was 15 back then and eager to make some money for myself. I was getting my driver's license soon, and if I was going to enjoy my newfound freedom to the fullest, I would need money. So I began sweet-talking all of the neighboring families, mentioning all of the babysitting I had done in my old neighborhood. In reality, I had never done any babysitting before, but I figured they didn't need to know that. Before long, my Friday and Saturday nights were booked solid with babysitting jobs that brought in ridiculous amounts of money for very little work. Typically, I only had to take care of 1 or 2 kids for a couple of hours before putting them to bed, and I quickly became comfortable with my duties. Most of the jobs were boring, but the Miller kids were always a chore to take care of. The Millers lived in the house directly beside us, and they had identical twin boys who were both nightmares to watch. Their names were Jack and Michael. Jack was a quiet boy, and he was always my favorite between the pair. Michael, on the other hand, was hyperactive and constantly loud. He liked to boss Jack around, and on more than one occasion, I would leave to get a snack ready for the boys or use the bathroom, only to come back to find Michael trying to beat Jack senseless on the floor. I wouldn't have really thought anything of it, boys will be boys, but there was just something about the way Jack interacted with Michael that was off-putting to me. He would cower from him sometimes and shut his eyes. When he did this, Michael would lean down and whisper in his ear. I could never make out what Michael was saying, and the one time I tried to lean in to listen, Michael snapped his head up and stared at me, clearly angry that I was trying to eavesdrop. He was just a 5-year-old boy, but something about it gave me the creeps. Jack would talk to him, though, and sometimes they seemed to get along well. Always, at the end of the night, Jack would beg me not to tell his parents about anything bad that Michael did. A few times I told him that I'd had enough, and that I was going to tell them anyway, but the look of fear in his eyes after I said it always kept me from doing so. At the end of the night, his parents would go up to the room that the boys shared, check on them, then come back down to pay me. Then I would leave. I did this probably 12 times for the Millers. A year ago, after a particularly bad night of Michael behaving horribly and tormenting Jack, I decided it was finally time to tell his parents about it. I put the boys to bed and decided not to mention my plans to Jack. When the boys' parents came home, I told them right away. The look on their faces when I mentioned Michael's behavior made me instantly regret saying anything. They paid me without a word, and Mr. Miller asked me to leave. He said that they appreciated all the times I had babysat for them, but not to expect any more calls from them. I walked out of the house stunned. I had no idea what would make them act like that. The next weekend, I was at another neighbor's house, the Howards, to babysit, and I asked them if there was any reason that talking to the Millers about Michael would bother them. I sat horrified as Mrs. Howard told me the story of how, 3 years ago, Michael had gotten hit and killed by a car after running into the road right in front of their house. I don't know how to explain what I saw so many times at the Millers, but needless to say, I quit my babysitting jobs after that. So I am a single mom of twin boys, who we'll call Luther and Donovan 3. My husband died of cancer 4 months after they were born, just 48 hours after being diagnosed. It was obviously a huge shock, but luckily I have amazing family and friends who all rallied together to take care of me and my boys. I still see a therapist, but the years are passing, and I can feel the pain fading more and more with each year. My husband and I were very smart with our money and waited about 10 years before trying for our boys. When he died, I received a considerable sum of money in the form of life insurance and such. I am also a trained RN and went back to work about a year after he died, when I felt like I could be away from Luther and Donovan. However, going back to work meant placing them in a daycare program. At first, it was great, but then it wasn't. To spare the details, one of my boys came home with a cut lip and black eye, and magically, no one saw how it happened. Granted, boys can be boys, but that's a fairly large injury for no one to see happen. So, I decided to hire a nanny. I went through a nanny service in my city and was paired with a couple of candidates, but I never really felt the click with anyone until I met Tabitha, 24. Tabitha and I had an instant connection from the moment we met. What's even more amazing is the connection she instantly had with my twins, even Luther, who is extremely shy. They all just instantly fell in love, and I was beyond grateful. I come home to a clean house, happy kids, and dinner. I more than make it up in compensation to Tabitha in hopes that she'll stay with us for the years to come. But now my problem is this. Tabitha is stunningly beautiful. I mean, the first moment I met her, my jaw almost touched the ground. She is the kind of natural beauty that is almost sickening, because it's just so unfair that a human can look that good without even trying. Her beauty was obviously never an issue for me at all, since she also happens to be an amazing person and nanny for my family. My husband and I moved into our neighborhood around our 5th year of marriage, so these are all families I know very well. Some of them were a huge support during the time of his death. Most of the families are young husbands and wives, and a few of them have nannies as well. They schedule play dates on an app called Meetup and go to parks and fun activities with all the kids. I told Tabitha about it right away, and she was extremely excited to be out and about with other adults, and to let the twins socialize with other kids. The first event came and went, and I, of course, asked Tabitha how it went. She seemed a little guarded as she told me, fine, and didn't go into many more details. I just shrugged it off and honestly didn't think much about it. About a week later, I got a notification for another meetup and told Tabitha about it. She got really nervous and asked if she had to go. I said of course not, but what was the problem? She burst into tears and said that the last play date she went to was awful. She said that the moms refused to even look at her or talk to her, and when she asked a simple question, they snapped at her and said, "Obviously, there are no brains in that pretty body, huh?" She was stunned and decided to take the boys to the park playground since she obviously wasn't welcome. I guess the husband of one of these moms chased her down as she was leaving and told her that it was just petty jealousy and that he would talk to these women for her since they obviously did not know her, and any friend of our family was welcome in the neighborhood. Then he asked for her phone number to schedule more upcoming play dates that would be without the drama. Tabitha said that he was really nice and did not give off a creepy vibe at all. Then, I guess the text started. I know this father personally, as they are next door neighbors, and I just can't believe he would do this, but Tabitha even showed me her phone, and it was sickening to say the least. There were texts asking for nudes, texts saying that he watches her from his windows, texts saying he's falling in love with her, even a text saying he would pay her $1,000 just to smell her hair. What the actual F? Not only that, but then she started receiving text from other phone numbers I don't even have in my phone, claiming to be from other fathers in the neighborhood who are secret admirers and saying lewd and disgusting things to her. I literally have no idea what to do. I am not about to give up the nanny who has been nothing short of amazing with my children, that much I know. I know I could probably go to the police with the messages, but what can they do? She's not a minor, and they never acted upon anything, but some of these messages are really unnerving. Should I raise hell in my neighborhood and risk getting blacklisted? Not that I want friends like that anyway, but I know it will cause a huge uproar. Or should I even consider moving? I just don't know what to do. There's a village in the woods near my house. No one talks about it. It's stricken from all maps, but it's still there. Something still lives there. It used to be my home. My family and friends live there. I left them there. On cold days, when the knocking on my door is quiet, I think about them. I think about my childhood. I think about my friends. When I was young, we used to tell each other stories of what lived in the forest. Ghosts, ghouls, and demons. The worst was the dogman. My big sister told me the dogman was an old man who lived in the woods. A birth deformity twisted his face into a dog's. He walked through the trees naked on all fours. She told me he ate eyes. My best friend Lai told me not to listen to her. The dogman was just a story. Even so, dogman was not a human. He was a forest demon. The demons who lived in the forest couldn't hurt us. They couldn't even touch us. He was right. What they could do was so much worse. The horror started with the murders. We heard about the first incident from our neighbors. A local butcher came out of his house covered in blood and giggling. He had brutally murdered his entire family. He ate their eyes. They locked him in the village jailhouse until officers from the city could take him to court. The jailhouse was close to our home. I heard him laughing from my bedroom window. More and more events across the village. The tailor wandered the streets wearing human skin. An old woman sewed the eyes of her grandson shut. They were all locked together in the jailhouse. They laughed all the time, turning it more into a madhouse. They kept me up at night, listening to their insane words. But one night, I went to a deep sleep. I dreamt of a little girl. She was wearing a white dress and collecting flowers on the ground. I couldn't see her face. She spoke to me. Everyone in this village will die. I had heard of dream spirits before. Ghosts who would visit you in your dreams and give you omens. Was this a spirit trying to warn me? Leave this village. Leave and never come back. She put the flower down and turned to face me. She had no eyes. He is in the house. I woke up in cold sweat. Someone was in the room with me. I could see my mother's silhouette in the gas lamp's light from the hallway. There was something in her hand. Mom? Come here, Ling. She beckoned with her other hand. Mom, what are you? Ling, please come here. The light flickered on to the object. It was my sister's head. What did you? She lunged at me. Come here, Ling. Her hands wrapped around my neck and tightened. Give me your eyes. As my vision blurred, I reached up and dug my fingers into her eyes. She let a scream as blood squirted out. Her hands let go. I pushed her body aside and ran for the door. As I reached for the lock, I looked inside. She was standing dead still, staring at me with those bloody eyes. Come here. A voice completely unlike my mom calls out from the dark. I slammed the door shut. The sounds of wild scratching and banging came from the other side as I locked it. I started to search the house for my dad. My sister's headless body was in the living room. I found my dad in front of the back door, lying on the floor. The knife she used to cut out his eyes beside him. I walked out of my house looking for my neighbor, for the police, for any adult. Anyone to help me. I should have stayed inside. Outside, I saw my neighbor skinning his son's body in front of his house. His head jerked in my direction. Who's there? I can smell you. I ducked behind the trees. He stared in my direction for a while, before returning to his work. "I'll get you later." I crawled into the bushes and started to sneak my way through the village. The shrubbery covered much of the village, but the only way out to help was the village entrance. I wasn't the only one heading there. There was a mass of villagers. The butcher, the tailor, the police, Lia's parents. Almost everyone was walking to the entrance. I followed behind, hiding myself in the foliage. Near the village entrance, they stopped. They massed around the gate, not going outside. It was dark outside the gate. From the dark, dog eyes watched them. A vile voice called out, "I am hungry. Children, bring me children. Cut them into pieces and throw them into the dark." They took my friends. Lia's body was tossed first. I closed my eyes. The sounds came anyway. The severing of flesh and bones. The crunching of teeth. Inhumanly cruel laughter. When I opened them again, the sun's rays lit my face. I had passed out. My first thought was a horrible nightmare, and I wanted to rush home. Then I saw the bodies. The ground was stained a dark red. Flies and rats converged on a pile of torn flesh. I saw a child's skull picked clean. I saw Lia's blue eyes peeking from the rubble. A crow came in and snatched it. I ran out of the gate. Neighboring village was good distance away, and by the time I arrived, my throat was parched. All I could spit out was the word demon. Demon. 2 fishermen saw me on the edge of the woods and took me to some water. After I rested, I was taken to the shaman. In the village center, I told him about the monster and how it spread madness. The village shaman, a war veteran, was solemn when he heard my story. He told me to wait outside. Hours later, he gave his judgment before the whole village. The forest demons cannot touch living human flesh, so it makes puppets. To stop the spread of the madness, we must destroy all puppets. So he gave his orders. No one was to live. As night fell, they started a fire close to the village. They barricaded the paths around the entrance. With butcher knives and old rifles, they waited by the village entrance. But nobody ever came out. Even as the fire spread and crawled onto the roofs, no one came out. Even as houses burned to the ground and the smell of rotting flesh filled the air, no one came out. No screams. Only the sound of something chuckling in the dark. It got closer and closer, till the men swore it was coming right in front of them. Just before dawn, it turned into a chilling laughter before going silent. The shaman was disturbed, but he was sure of the ritual. He performed a ceremony the next morning and declared the village cleansed. Officially, my family and all my neighbors died in a fire started by the butcher. That was almost 50 years ago. My country has advanced a lot since. The fishing village is dead, its children all having moved on. I've grown old too. In my old age, I wanted to see my home. So last year, I went to visit the village. I did not expect to see the burned ashes of my home. I was realistic. The trees would consume my world in its whole. That is not what I saw. When I came to the village, I saw the village untouched. I saw the small houses where I lived. I saw the old trees unburned. I saw the people who lived there, the dog-headed people. I saw the butcher with his snarled face. I saw the tailor with her warped jaw. I saw Lie with those warped eyes. This did not feel like home. Something had taken over entirely. Something did not want me here. I hid myself in bushes, just like I did in my youth, and sneaked my through back to my car. I pushed on the gas and barreled down the road. It was late and night was falling. The shock had drained me. Sleep was gnawing at me. Not completely out of the village grounds, I fell asleep on the side of the road. For the first time in half a century, I dreamed of her again, of her white dress, of the flowers, of the empty holes where her eyes should have been, of her nails digging into the flesh of my shoulders, her mouth distorting into a scream. I told you never to come back. My eyes opened. There were 3 figures standing in front of the car. When I turned on the lights, I saw their faces. My father, mother, and sister with their twisted faces. They had no eyes. I put my car in reverse and pushed hard on the gas. Their gazes seemed to follow me as I backed onto the road. The engine roared as I thundered down the road. I saw them come out of the woods. Their decaying bodies just stopped short of the pavement. All through the woods, my whole town were standing by the edge of road, watching me with their eyeless sockets. As I neared the edge of the woods, I heard something behind me, a chuckling from inside the car. For a moment, as lightning lit the car, I saw him in the back seat. His twisted face, his dead stare, his deformed smile was the most disturbing expression I'd seen in my life. Then he was gone. The roads and woods were empty again. I never should have returned. They followed me home. I see my family every day now. I see them in the trees by my house. Late at night, I hear them knocking on my doors. I know they want me to join them. My husband and I have lived here about 1.5 years. I don't know this neighbor very well, and I'm guessing he's about 22. His mother is a single mom, and I've only ever seen glimpses of her leaving for work. They live across the street. The neighbor next to me is an elderly woman who lives alone, and then the other house has been for sale for the past 2 months now. Ever since the one house has been for sale and empty, I started noticing the neighbor boy hanging out at it with his pit bull in the backyard. He'd be sitting at the back porch, the dog would be unleashed, and wandering in my yard too, peeing in my garden, etc. I asked him several times to keep his dog out of my yard, and he was polite, but not complying. He didn't necessarily seem up to no good, but he seemed to lack awareness to the fact that he probably shouldn't hang out at an empty property. I started seeing him more and more at my backyard. There's nothing behind my house but woods, so no need to be there. My husband is military and would be gone for trainings, and I'd be home alone. I didn't like this situation and felt uncomfortable. One day I was at the side of my house between my house and the elderly neighbor's home, and he came walking up to me. I think he didn't expect me to be there. He said, "My bad," and ran off before I could say anything. I started wondering if he was cutting through the side of my house to get to the backyard. I really didn't like that. Today, he was again in my backyard with a pit bull, and it was peeing in my garden. I told him, "I don't want you or your dog in my yard, please." He went over to the empty house for a while. I waited to see if he would cut through the side of my yard to get back to the street. When he did, I went to the front door and again told him, "Do not go in yard." He ignored me. I said, "Acknowledge what I just said to you," and he nodded. I'm not trying to start a war with a neighbor, and I don't want to overreact. But do you think my instincts are right about this? Would it be worth it to call the police and have him TR spast if this happens again? Bob and Karen are our neighbors. They have an 18-year-old daughter, Terry. We were never especially close to them, but we always do neighborly stuff for them, like take in their mail if they're on vacation, water their grass, feed their cat, etc. They do the same for us. 2 weeks ago, my husband and I were going to go on a weekend trip to Las Vegas to see a show. We have an 11-year-old daughter, and she spent the weekend at her aunt's house, my husband's sister. We have a small dog, and we asked if Bob and Karen wouldn't mind feeding it while we were gone. They said they'd be glad to, and would we mind if their daughter be the one to do it. We've been acquainted with Terry ever since she was about 10 or so. When the family moved into the neighborhood, we moved in around the same time. We had no problem with it at all, so we left a key with the parents.
Sunday, when we were on our way back, I texted Karen to ask how everything was at home. She replied back fine, but she needed to discuss something important with me.
When we got home, we noticed a faint marijuana smell coming from the garage. We went into the garage and the smell was even worse. At that point, Karen and her husband came over to tell us that they had caught their daughter smoking marijuana in our garage with her boyfriend. After questioning her, the daughter claimed that she had found the marijuana in our garage and the temptation was too strong. According to Terry's story, she had been in the garage looking for a leash to walk the dog, although all the dog's supplies were set out on the kitchen for convenience. My husband and I both informed our neighbors that this story was ridiculous. However, Bob and Karen went on to say that they know their daughter and that she would never lie to them. Bob in particular got on his soapbox and started to lecture us how wrong it was for us to keep drugs in our house when we have a young child. I had to squeeze my husband's hand to remind him not to lose his temper, but we let them both know that the drugs were certainly not ours, and that they had better keep a better eye on their own children, and that Terry is an adult and could face serious consequences if found with drugs. Bob and Karen smirked at this suggestion and said it was pretty ironic for us to mention the law when we should supposedly be the ones being thrown in jail for furnishing drugs to minors or having drugs within reach of children, our daughter. We once again reiterated that the drugs were not ours and that we would not stand for their accusations any longer. They left in a huff. Their daughter had since returned to her college campus and thus avoided me ever confronting her. We asked to speak to her that very day, but they said she was too distraught and that she had suffered enough. My husband is wondering how our neighbors caught their daughter smoking pot at our house in the first place. Was the garage door open? Were they making a lot of noise? Does the boyfriend have a distinctive car, the sight of which caused the father to investigate a little more? Something doesn't add up. Just to make it clear, neither my husband and I have any interest in pot or any other drugs. We only drink wine on occasion at fancy dinners. But it doesn't end there. Bob and Karen have started to tell the other neighbors that we are drug users, and that their daughter found drugs in our garage, and you know how curious kids can be, so they smoked it. I ran into a neighbor at the grocery store, and she told me that Karen had told me about what happened. I gave her my version of events, and she tut-tutted me and said it was a shame I was living in denial. This really makes me angry and upset. Also, my husband and I have no intention of moving as we have too much money invested in this house. I am afraid Bob and Karen might even try to tell my husband's employers about this. He works in aerospace, and although I don't think they'll care if he smokes pot, I don't like what it will do for his reputation. I myself work as a preschool teacher, and some of my neighbors are whispering how shameful it is that I am around children when I am supposedly a huge druggie. I know I would be ruined if this reached my superiors. What can we do about this? I know my husband and I are innocent, and that Terry is lying to her parents and threw us under the bus, and her parents swallowed her story, either because it's easier than facing the truth, or they're really just that stupid. Looking for ideas. I'm catching side-eye from everyone here these days. I'm in college and my sister is in a boarding school. Today she asked me to call her. Calling from her hostel is regulated and only to registered 3 numbers, of which I am not one. This is a rare occurrence. She doesn't ask that of me often, only when she's extremely worried and needs to speak in confidence. We talked normally for some time until she asked me shakily if I ever had hallucinations, particularly the violent kind. Before I go any further, here are a few things you should know. My sister is not very academically gifted. Her exams are in a day. She had recently attended a compulsory camp, which is a part of academic credit in another part of her city. I have my exams in 2 days too and live in a different city than hers. She was trying very hard to maintain her composure as she detailed how she was feeling unwell 5 days ago at the camp, and was asked to rest in the room assigned to her school group alone and trying to fall asleep, at which point I heard her voice get choked up and could sense her oncoming tears. She said she sees them every day ever since, 5 minutes after closing her eyes, and feels like she's being watched all the time. I asked her to describe what she meant by them. All she said was, "It's so bloody." To help her verbalize, I asked her to reply with yes and no while I described things that she could have possibly seen. I asked her if she saw a cut body. By this point she had started sobbing, saying there's so many of them. I asked how many. She said 3, 4 each time, depends. I asked her if she knew any of them, and she said she doesn't, but that although they're not always the same, it almost seems like they're on rotation because she sees recurring faces once in a while. I asked her how they appear, and she said that they would always walk towards her. And on asking about the BG, she said she saw approximations of her surroundings at whatever point in time she tries to fall asleep. It's been 5 days, and she's barely had any proper rest or sleep. By this point, she's near hysterical, barely able to breathe as she talks. I asked to speak to her few friends whom she's told this to, who reaffirm her story her. She goes on to ask me to not tell our parents because she doesn't want to worry them or be made out to be a liar. I spoke after asking her permission to our eldest sibling, 22 male, who thinks she might be making this up to not give her exams because, in his words, the only other alternative to him, something supernatural, is too messed up and horrifying to consider. I asked her to speak to her school counselor tomorrow. I'm inclined to believe she's telling the truth because I know her to be capable of many things, but feigning hitched breaths to near hysteria over the phone while telling such a gut-wrenching ordeal merely to weasel her way out of paltry exams is not one of them. I had to sing to help her calm down, something I haven't done in the last 4 years. I'm holding out hope that this is either stress or a recurring nightmare. Her school is extremely strict, and there is a near impossible chance that they would believe her enough to let her take the exams some other time. She has not been able to keep up in class or her sports practices. She has to leave for a national-level competition soon after the exams are over. The whole ordeal is affecting not only her athletic and academic performance, but also taking an emotional and mental toll on her. I haven't heard her sound so worse for wear in years. I'm frustrated I can't help her, scared of what she's going through, and want to know what I can do for her. Is there any way to help? Part 2. Let me begin by apologizing for not interacting individually with everyone that responded to my previous post. Exam time's been keeping me up to my neck in books. Thank you for your help. I'm so grateful. I talked to my sister again yesterday and explained to her that maybe a stress-generated problem or the possibility of her being ill, for which she might need to see a psychiatrist. It's because she requested in the first place that I do not inform our parents that I agreed to it. However, I explained to her that if she needs further treatment, we will need to tell them, and she has agreed because I spent a considerable amount of time explaining that I did not, in fact, think that she was a lunatic, and that mental illnesses need to be addressed the same way physical illnesses are, and that I just want her to get better, the same way she does. I talked about the same with my brother, who concurs. She has agreed, but only after first seeing a psychologist employed by her school. She went to the counselor that day, and was advised to do so, whom she will be seeing today. Hopefully things will get better, and I'll try my best to help explain her condition to our parents to keep them from doubting her. Truthfully, I could not have had this talk or reasoned through this situation without all of you. I am extremely thankful.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.